Chapter 12. At least the men had not hurt Bertie. She'd lost one of her little front teeth when she fell from the wagon. Her mouth was still bleeding a bit, but otherwise she was all right. And incredibly, she did not seem scared. "Don't worry, Thomas," Bertie whispered. "Our men are coming for us." Thomas didn't have the heart to tell her the truth, that they were on their own. "All right," the burly man shouted. "Let's move out of here." Thomas felt doomed. He'd heard about the slave auctions where they'd be lined up like animals. Buyers would check their teeth and their feet. There was little chance that he and Bertie would be sold to the same owner. He looked up at the sky, wishing, praying, searching for one last flicker of hope. And then, boom! A rifle shot echoed through the forest, sending birds flapping wildly out of the trees and bushes. A familiar voice bellowed, "Drop your weapons!" It was Captain Campbell. Thomas's heart leaped as familiar faces appeared through the trees. The captain, Henry, Homer, even Lester was there, though he was hobbling and in obvious pain. There were at least 50 more Union soldiers with them. "We have you surrounded," the captain said. "We will shoot every one of you if you don't put your rifles down." Thomas couldn't imagine how they'd managed to sneak into the woods, but they had, and now they had formed an armed circle around the rebels. The cavalrymen put down their rifles. Captain Campbell stepped forward. "We have not come here to do battle. We have not come to take prisoners. We have come for the children." The burly man stepped forward. "We didn't hurt them," he said. "We didn't lay a hand on them." Captain Campbell signaled to Henry, who headed for Thomas and Bertie. The tall man glared at him with narrow eyes. And then, quick as a flash, he reached behind himself and grabbed something from his belt. His pistol! He aimed it at Henry. Boom! The tall man jerked back, dropped his weapon, and fell to the ground, clutching his leg. "Anyone else?" the captain shouted, lowering his smoking rifle. The rebels stood silent, their hands in the air. Henry grabbed the pistol from the dirt. He rushed over to the tall man, his eyes flashing with wild fury. He aimed the gun at the man's head. He stood for a moment, his hand steady, the pistol glinting in the sun. Henry looked like a different person, his eyes filled with fury and even hate. But then he lowered his arm. "No," he said. He turned and hurled the pistol into the churning waters of the nearby stream, which swept it away. Some of the men gasped. Thomas knew how prized those Confederate pistols were, and that some Union soldiers tried to capture them on the battlefields to bring home as trophies. But not Henry. He strode over and cut Thomas and Bertie's ropes with his knife. Henry wrapped a strong arm around Thomas's shoulder, and they walked slowly together towards the road. Thomas braced himself for more shots. But they made it to the road, and minutes later, the rest of the soldiers appeared. They'd captured all of the men's horses and their rifles. "Those Rebs won't be bothering us again," Captain Campbell said. The rest of the regiment was ahead, and now they'd have to move quickly to catch up. Thomas climbed in the supply wagon with Bertie. He was going to stick close to her from now on. Before long, she fell asleep on Thomas's shoulder. Henry and Captain Campbell walked alongside the wagon, their eyes scanning the woods, their rifles loaded and ready. Thomas kept a grip on Bertie. It was some time before he stopped shaking, before he could peel his eyes away from the hills. For a few moments, he even managed to sleep. But soon there was thundering in the distance and great clouds of black and white smoke billowing in the sky. At first, Thomas thought it was a rainstorm coming towards them. But no. "Cannons," Henry said. It was the Battle of Gettysburg, and they were heading right for it. Chapter 13, July 2nd, 1863, 8:30 p.m., Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It was getting dark when they arrived. The fighting had ended for the day, and at first, the news about the day's fighting seemed grim. The Union troops had been badly outnumbered. They had lost thousands of soldiers. But then Captain Campbell learned that somehow the scrappy Union soldiers had managed to hold the high ground. "Our cannons are in the hills," he said. "We're dug in." Troops had been pouring into Gettysburg all day, and tens of thousands more would arrive overnight. The roads around the town were so crowded that the wagon Thomas and Bertie were riding in could barely move. They got out and walked with Henry. Thomas had never seen so many people in one place, thousands of Union soldiers. As they made their way through the town, it seemed that every inch of grass was covered by a tent. Supply wagons lined the roads, horses and mules were tied to every fence and tree. Henry talked to some of the soldiers they'd passed, eager for news of the day's fighting. But these men were just arriving, too. Some men looked more ragged than Bertie's doll. One soldier said his regiment had been marching for more than 3 weeks. Bertie stared at the crowds of men. "They're all here to protect us?" she said, her eyes wide in amazement. Thomas almost smiled. Of course, Bertie would think that this war was her own personal army. Henry picked Bertie up. "Yes, Bert," he said. "They are here for you." Thomas could see Henry wasn't joking. And maybe Bertie wasn't wrong. These men were fighting for him and Bertie, weren't they? Fighting so that they could be free. Henry carried Bertie as they passed a long line of supply wagons stuck on the side of the road. Suddenly, Bertie gasped. "Look at those men!" she cried, pointing. Thomas turned, and he too stared at the crowd of men surrounding the front wagon. "They look like us!" Bertie exclaimed. The men were black. "They're teamsters," Henry said. "They're paid by the Union Army to run supplies from camp to camp. It's tough work, dangerous too. We've got thousands of those men working for us. We couldn't fight this war without them." Thomas felt a jolt of excitement. Those men were free. They were working for the Union. "Hello!" Bertie sang out as they passed, waving madly. "Hello!" The men looked up in surprise, their tired and dusty faces melting into smiles at the sight of Bertie. Thomas wished he could talk to them. Where had they come from? How had they gotten here? But there was no time. Their regiment had been ordered to set up camp in a wooded field outside of the town and wait for their orders. "We're in for a tough battle tomorrow," Captain Campbell said. "Get rest now, but be ready, men." The men dropped their bedrolls and knapsacks and collapsed to the ground. They peeled off their boots and socks and washed their bloodied and blistered feet. And then most of them fell asleep, not even bothering to eat supper or spread out their blankets. Thomas and Bertie slept too. But sometime later that night, the entire camp was awakened by the bugler, followed by Captain Campbell's booming voice. "Wake up, men," he bellowed. "The time has come." The men staggered to their feet and gathered around the captain. "We will march across the ridge and take up a position in the hills," the captain announced, pointing into the darkness behind them. "By morning, the rebels will be on the attack. Our mission is to help hold the ground." Just hours ago, the men had looked so ragged and battered they could barely stand. Now they were alert, standing strong. "The fighting will be fierce," the captain said. "The rebels will come at us hard. They will fight with all their might to knock us from those hills, to crush us. But we will hold our ground, men. We will hold our ground." The soldiers listened with hard expressions. "Yes, Captain," a soldier yelled. "We will hold the ground," shouted another. The captain looked around, his steely gaze seeming to fall on each and every man. "This is it, men," he said, his voice rising. "Everything has led to this place, to this moment. This is our time." Someone shouted out a word. "Fredericksburg!" It seemed to hover in the air. Someone else shouted it, and then more and more, until the shouts were a wild chanting chorus. "Fredericksburg! Fredericksburg! Fredericksburg!" The men pumped their fists, their eyes fiery. And at first Thomas didn't understand. Why would they want to remember that terrible battle where their regiment had lost so many men? Why were they thinking they would lose this battle too? But as the chants grew louder, Thomas could see that the men were turning that day into something new, something strong that they would take with them into battle. Finally, the captain held up his hands. "Let's go, men." As the men scrambled to line up, Henry took Thomas aside. "You and Bertie will stay here with Homer and Les," he said. "They will keep you safe. You will stay with them no matter what." Thomas nodded. A man shouted to Henry, "Come on!" Henry ignored him. He put his hands on Thomas's shoulders and he looked him straight in the eye. "Remember what I told you," he said, "during the march, that I want you and Bertie to come to Vermont." "We will go," Thomas said. "We want to go with you." "Good," Henry said. "You will have a fine and happy life there." "I know we will," Thomas said. Captain Campbell was yelling now, ordering the men to start marching. "And Thomas, we can't know what will happen out there, so I want you to make me a promise." He gripped Thomas tighter. "No matter what happens to me, you will go to Vermont. You will live with my family." What was Henry saying? "Promise me," Henry said, his eyes fixed on Thomas's. Thomas nodded weakly. Henry reached into his knapsack and pulled out the book of paintings Mary had made for him. "Keep this for me," he said, slipping it into Thomas's shirt pocket. And then he put his hand on Thomas's head, nodded, and quickly turned away. A second later, he was gone. Chapter 14. When the fighting began, explosions of cannon fire were booming from both sides. The explosions got louder and louder and came so quickly that there was just one tremendous noise. as though every tree on earth was crashing to the ground at once. The earth under their feet shook. The noise pounded in their ears. Bertie stayed in the wagon with Les, whose leg was in such bad shape that he could barely walk. Homer and Thomas stood on a big rock near the wagon. They could see the hills and the fields below. Right now, there was too much cannon smoke to see much. But earlier that morning, when all was still quiet, Homer had pointed out the spot where the men from their regiment were positioned, a small hill covered with scrubby trees and big rocks. It didn't look like much, especially from far away, but it was one of the highest points in Gettysburg. It's worth fighting for, Homer said, and our men are tough. By God, we'll fight for it. If those rebels want it, they're going to have to try to rip it out of our hands. He pointed to the meadow just below the rocky hill. I'd guess that within a few hours, there are going to be thousands of rebel troops charging across that meadow to try to take the high ground. Thomas kept his eye on the smoke he seen below. Every so often, a gust of wind would clear the smoke for a few seconds, and Thomas would catch a glimpse of the field. So far, there were no soldiers charging across it. Maybe there never would be. Suddenly, a messenger on horseback came galloping up. The captain needs the ammunition wagon right away. We were ordered to stay here, Homer said. They need more cartridges now. All right, Homer said. We'll get it right up there. Les got up and tried to hop over to the ammunition wagon, his face sweaty and white with pain. Let me go, Thomas said. Bertie was fast asleep. He would be back before she woke up. Homer and Les looked nervously at each other, but then Homer gave a nod. Thomas hopped onto the wagon, and Homer snapped the reins. The horses moved swiftly out of the field and up a dusty road. Keep your head down, Homer said. The horses faltered, struggling to get up a rocky stretch of the road. They'd barely made it to the top of the hill when there was a whistling sound. Look out! A voice screamed. There was a deafening explosion. Kaboom! And a tree right behind them shattered into a million shards of wood. The horses panicked, and Homer quickly unhitched them from the wagon. Come on, he called. Let's grab some boxes and run up there. But then there was more whistling. Thomas, run! Thomas sprinted away seconds before a cannonball smashed into the wagon. Kaboom! Thomas felt, though, as his head had been smacked into a stone wall. A shard of metal sliced his forehead. Another carved a jagged gash into his right thigh. The wagon erupted into a fireball as he hit the ground. Flames chased after him. Men groaned and screamed. Thomas! Called Homer. Thomas gasped in the smoke. Blood spilled into his eyes. He couldn't breathe. Burning wood surrounded him. He crawled away, his leg throbbing with pain. He was desperate to escape the flames and smoke. He rolled down the hill, down, 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 until he reached the flat grass of the meadow. His head pounded. He could feel the blood gushing from his leg. It was a bad cut, very bad. The smoke burned his eyes and his lungs. It was hard to breathe, to even think. Down in the grass, there wasn't as much smoke. A breeze blew, and for a few seconds the air cleared. Thomas could see across the field. He froze in terror. There they were, rebel soldiers ready to charge. There were thousands of them, men in front on horsebacks, waving gleaming swords. Behind them, two lines of men stretched out across the entire meadow, soldiers with their rifles raised. Suddenly there was a noise, rising above the booms, a howling scream that rushed across the meadow like a raging wind. The rebel yell. The men were screaming as they began their charge across the meadow. Thomas had to get away, but where could he go? The rebel cannons still boomed, sending their deadly balls and shells into the hills behind him. Thomas turned to climb back up to the high ground. But now there was thundering of thousands of pounding rebel boots. It was too late. The rebel soldier was running towards Thomas, his eyes glowing, blood-red through the smoke, his face twisting into an awful killing grin. No! Thomas screamed. He couldn't die here. He couldn't leave Bertie. Boom! The bullet hit Thomas, and his chest seemed to explode. The world around him spun, the sky fell, and the air turned bright white. Thomas hit the ground hard, his body sinking into soft, blood-soaked grass. Chapter 15. Later, there was pain, and voices calling to him. Was he dead? No, he was back with Mr. Knox. That must be why his entire body hurt, because he was back on the farm, working dawn to dusk. He could hear Bertie feel her little hand gripping his. But who was that other man calling his name? Thomas! Thomas! Thomas tried to open his eyes, but there was just darkness. He tried to speak, but his voice was like ashes. He wanted to move, but he felt hands holding him down. Or were they chains? Searing pain ripped across his chest. Mr. Knox, please don't whip me. He was a slave again. Or was he dead? 2 days passed before Thomas realized that he was alive, and that he was not back at Mr. Knox's farm. He was in a hospital tent, still in Gettysburg. He'd been carried off the battlefield along with thousands of others. His pants had been soaked in blood, his eyes swollen shut. When the ambulance crew was searching the field for wounded, at first they thought Thomas was dead. But then they heard him shout, "Bertie!" They had just put him on a stretcher carefully, wondering how on earth this boy had gotten himself onto this battlefield, assuming he was a servant to one of the officers. Most of his blood had spilled into the grass from the enormous gash on his leg. The rebel's bullet had bruised his chest. It would have killed him, ripped right through his heart, except it was stopped by the tin-covered book in his shirt pocket, Mary's book of paintings. That's what saved his life, not a rifle or a sword. He was saved by a book filled with pretty pictures of a world Thomas had never seen. The doctors stitched him up and left him, caught between life and death, as battles raged all around Gettysburg. They fought for 3 days in all. They battled in meadows and fields, in orchards and woods, on hilltops and in valleys. Streams ran red with blood. 23,000 men were killed or wounded before the rebels finally retreated. The Union soldiers held their high ground, but Thomas knew none of this. He didn't know that Homer was killed by a shell, and that Captain Campbell was brought down as he tried to protect 2 of his men from charging rebel soldiers, and that Henry was hit by a bullet, which shattered his leg. Thomas learned all this days later when his head finally cleared, and in that first moment after he opened his eyes, he thought he was dreaming, or in heaven, because there was Bertie smiling at him through tears, and next to her was the man who'd been calling Thomas's name, Clem. Chapter 16, November 8th, 1863, Burlington, Vermont. Thomas sat at a desk next to Bertie, carefully writing out his letters. All around the schoolroom, children sat quietly as their pretty teacher watched over them. Every so often she came to Thomas's desk. "Fine work, Thomas," said Miss Ashford, Mary, Henry's sweetheart. Thomas nodded, hoping he didn't look too proud. It had been 5 months since they'd arrived, and his handwriting was looking better. He practiced for hours every night, sitting at Henry's old desk as Mr. and Mrs. Green sat nearby and read. Henry's parents still weren't sleeping much, and they seemed glad to have a reason to keep their candles burning into the night. "Look at mine, Miss Ashford," Bertie said, holding up her paper covered with wobbly letters. Miss Ashford smiled at Bertie, then put her finger up in front of her lips with a gentle shake. Bertie loved school more than anyone, but she kept forgetting she wasn't the only student. At lunchtime, Thomas and Bertie sat under a tree. It was getting colder and the sky was gray. Soon winter would come. Mrs. Green had already sewn 3 wool dresses for Bertie and 2 new pairs of trousers for Thomas. Thomas ate his lunch and looked around the schoolyard. The air smelled like apples, just like Henry had said. Thomas swallowed hard and glanced at Bertie. She didn't have to ask him why he was sad. No, Henry hadn't made it. But they'd come here to Vermont, like he told them to, and his family had welcomed them, just like he promised they would. The whole town did. Thomas had been shocked to see the stacks of letters Henry had written, pages filled with stories about Thomas and Bertie. "What a gift to have you here with us," Mrs. Green had said when they first arrived. "A gift from Henry." It was Clem who had brought them here, on the train, 1 month after Gettysburg. During that long ride, Clem had told them every detail of what had happened to him after he was taken away from Mr. Knox's. The plantation in Mississippi had been a brutal place, where slaves were worked to the bone picking cotton in the blistering sun. After a year, Clem escaped. He traveled more than 600 miles on his own, dodging snakes and bears and slave catchers. "I was coming to get you both," he said. "I wanted us to go north together." But in North Carolina, he was caught by a band of rebel soldiers, taken just like Bertie. They got him halfway back to Mississippi when he was freed by a band of teamsters, who attacked the rebel camp at night and helped Clem and 4 other men escape. Clem went to work with them, running wagons filled with supplies. After Gettysburg, Clem had loved being in Vermont with Thomas, Bertie, and Mr. and Mrs. Green, but he could only stay 1 week before he headed back down south. Mr. and Mrs. Green wanted him to stay longer, but Clem had a new plan, to be a soldier for the North. He had already signed up to be in one of the first black regiments of the Union Army. I'll be back here, Clem had said as he hugged them all goodbye. I promise I'll be back when it's all done. He wrote to them almost every day now, and Thomas would sit for hours sounding out every new word. He could hear Clem's voice in his mind, describing the battles, the people he met, his plans for after the war. We'll be together, he wrote. Can you picture it? And Thomas could. His mind was filled with bright pictures now. At first, most of the pictures had appeared in his nightmares. The wagon in flames, the vultures that had circled above the battlefield as he lay wounded, the glowing red eyes of the rebel who shot him. But there were happier pictures too. The memories of Bert and Clem standing by his bed in the hospital tent, with Mr. and Mrs. Green waiting for them at the train station. And now, in the schoolyard, he closed his eyes, and he saw the newest pictures, the pictures of his hopes, that this terrible war would end, that Clem would be back with them soon, that they would be here together and free. His eyes were still closed when he felt something cold on his cheeks. He looked up and saw white flakes drifting in the air. Thomas, Bertie cried, it's snow! Thomas put his arm around his little sister, and together they watched the icy flowers fall from the sky.